5 royal deaths, 5 deceptions, 5 assassinations hidden by dynasties for generations. We've been told these rulers perished of natural causes. But what if that's the exact story their murderers wanted us to believe? Tonight, we're unveiling the royal killings that kingdoms worked tirelessly to erase from the pages of history. From a queen betrayed and poisoned by her own bloodline, to a prince who uncovered secrets he was never meant to know. These are the forbidden truths they hoped you would never find. If dark secrets and erased chapters of history fascinate you, subscribe now. A new forbidden tale drops here every single day. Yes, tonight's theme is royal murders that were covered up for centuries. The kind of deaths where the official line was natural causes, while the unofficial reality involved poison, strangulation, or simply being locked in a room until you stopped moving. Now, let's drift gently to our first case. Prince Albert Victor and the Ripper. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to Victorian England. The streets are dark, the fog is thick, and the royal family is, well, not having its best decade. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's float into the strange life of a prince who has been accused of many things, most of them absurd, yet still remains one of history's most curious mysteries. Prince Albert Victor, also known as Eddie to his friends and family, was born in 1864. He was the grandson of Queen Victoria and the second in line to the throne, which in Victorian terms meant 2 things. He would be smothered in privilege and quietly judged for not quite meeting the royal standard. You see, Eddie wasn't exactly what his family had hoped for in an heir. His tutors reported that he was not particularly bright. One even suggested he had the intellectual energy of a quietly confused houseplant. But because he was royal, and because royal bloodlines must go on no matter what, Eddie was dutifully prepared for a future of ceremonial ribbon cutting and generally trying not to trip over himself in public. Now, around this time, London had a rather famous problem: Jack the Ripper. And because Victorian society loved a good scandal, someone inevitably wondered, what if the Ripper wasn't some nameless shadow in the East End, but a member of the royal family? And who better than Eddie, the somewhat awkward, possibly slow prince who seemed like he might not notice if he wandered into a crime scene by mistake? Of course, the evidence for this is thin. By thin, we mean practically non-existent. Eddie wasn't even in London during some of the murders, but Victorian conspiracy theories were like fog. Once they settled, they were hard to see through. And naturally, the story got worse. Some claimed Eddie had a secret marriage with a Catholic woman, which was not just frowned upon. It was basically a royal nightmare. The theory went that the Ripper killings were part of a cover-up. Did that make sense? No. Did it stop people from saying it? Also no. Eddie's life was one long exercise in almosts. Almost a proper heir. Almost a husband. He was once engaged to Princess Mary of Teck, who later married his younger brother after Eddie died. And almost, according to sensationalist rumors, a murderer. But the reality of his life was far sadder and far quieter. Eddie died young, at 28, from influenza during one of the last great pandemics of the 19th century. His death was said to devastate Queen Victoria, though some courtiers privately sighed with relief, since the monarchy had been spared what they called a constitutional headache with legs: the Romanov family. Tonight, we drift from foggy London to the endless snows of Imperial Russia, where the Romanov dynasty was holding on to a world that was quietly slipping through its fingers. The last years of their empire were marked by wealth, extravagance, and unfortunately, some of the worst decision-making a royal court has ever managed to display. Nicholas II, the last Tsar, was a man of contradictions. He wanted to be seen as a strong ruler, but deep down, he seemed to prefer quiet family life to the messy business of running an empire. He loved his wife, Alexandra, adored his children, and often spent long evenings reading to them instead of attending to the political crises that kept stacking up like cordwood outside his palace doors. And those crises? They were not small. Russia was sprawling, underdeveloped, and on the verge of revolution. But in the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, the Romanovs preferred to focus on dinner parties, French tutors for the children, and the more pressing question of which royal cousin in Europe had sent the best Christmas gifts. Then came Alexei, the heir to the throne. He was a sweet, delicate child who carried a terrible secret in his blood. He had hemophilia, a disease that meant even the smallest injury could lead to life-threatening bleeding. This condition was not random. It came from generations of intermarriage between European royals, all of whom seemed to believe that the family tree should look more like a circle. Naturally, this led to desperate attempts to keep Alexei safe, and to anyone who promised a cure being welcomed with open arms. Enter Rasputin, a wandering mystic with questionable hygiene and excellent timing. Rasputin somehow convinced the Romanovs that he alone could ease the boy's suffering, and in a way, he did. Whether through hypnosis, calming influence, or pure luck, Alexei seemed to recover after Rasputin's visits. Of course, this created a problem. The Russian aristocracy was scandalized. They whispered that the imperial family was under the spell of a mad monk who drank too much, stared too long, and had opinions on palace policy. And because of course they did, the rumors turned increasingly lurid. Rasputin was accused of everything from political manipulation to affairs with members of the royal household. Meanwhile, the empire outside the palace was starving, freezing, and growing very tired of its rulers. The Romanovs were still hosting dinners and staging portraits, but revolution was no longer a distant threat. It was an approaching storm. The final chapter of their lives is famously grim. In 1918, after the monarchy had collapsed, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg. The official accounts are clinical, but historians can't help noting the bitter irony. A family that had lived in unimaginable luxury died with none. And yet, in the soft light of hindsight, it's not the conspiracy theories or the jewels that define the Romanovs. It's the quiet image of them as they wanted to be seen, parents and children, huddled together, believing until the very end that their name still meant something. King Ananda Mahidol of Thailand. Tonight, we drift to 1940s Thailand, a kingdom standing at the crossroads of tradition, colonial influence, and a war-torn world. At its center was a young king who seemed destined for greatness. Instead, his life became one of history's most haunting royal mysteries. King Ananda Mahidol, known affectionately as Rama VIII, was not raised to be a king in the usual sense. Born in 1925, he spent most of his early life in Switzerland, far from the heat and grandeur of Bangkok's palaces. The young prince was quiet, shy, and according to his teachers, a boy more interested in books than in being bowed to. In other words, he seemed perfectly happy not ruling a country. But fate intervened. In 1935, his uncle, King Prajatapak, abdicated the throne. The reason? Growing political unrest, a rising constitutional government, and, quite possibly, sheer exhaustion from being a monarch in an age that didn't much like monarchs. Suddenly, the 9-year-old Ananda was declared king, though he remained in Switzerland for schooling, because no one thought it wise to drop a child into the storm of Thai politics just yet. By 1945, with World War II ending and Thailand looking to re-establish stability, Ananda finally returned to Bangkok. He was only 19, young, inexperienced, and walking into a palace full of factions, some royalist, some republican, and many simply waiting to see which way the winds of power would blow. Then, in June 1946, tragedy struck. Ananda was found dead in his bed with a single gunshot wound to the head. He had been due to meet with officials later that morning. Instead, the palace found itself in chaos. The official investigations offered no clarity. Was it an accident? Suicide? Assassination? Each possibility came with more questions than answers. Theories spread like wildfire. Some said he had been cleaning his pistol and it discharged, plausible, but unlikely. Others suggested palace intrigue, factions within the government or even within the royal circle seeking to control succession. What made matters worse was the trial that followed. 3 palace aides were accused of conspiring to kill the king, and after a controversial process, one that many historians consider deeply flawed, they were executed. Yet the mystery remained unsolved. Who truly killed Ananda Mahidol? Or was it a terrible accident after all? In the wake of his death, his younger brother, Bhumibol Adulyadej, ascended the throne as Rama IX, later becoming one of the longest reigning monarchs in history. But even his long and celebrated rule could not erase the quiet, unsettling mystery of how a young king's life ended so abruptly. The palace never speaks of it now, and perhaps it's best left that way, an unsolved chapter preserved in the soft shadows of history. Let's drift on to another royal life, one that's less mysterious, yet no less peculiar, involving a man who built castles for his dreams rather than for his people. Emperor Sushun of Japan. Tonight, we drift to ancient Japan, back to the early 6th century, where history begins to blur with legend, and where emperors could be both sacred figures and very mortal pawns in courtly intrigue. Emperor Sushun's reign was brief. His life? A study in how quickly royal favor could shift when the wrong people held the strings of power. Sushun was never meant to be the central figure of his dynasty. Born into the Yamato line, he was one of several royal princes living under the watchful eye of Japan's powerful aristocratic clans. At the time, the Soga clan, ambitious, wealthy, and never entirely subtle, was calling most of the shots in imperial politics. When Sushun came to the throne in 587, it wasn't because of his personal charisma or military prowess. It was because the Soga clan decided he would be useful. He was crowned at a time when Buddhism was beginning to spread across Japan, bringing new art, new rituals, and, of course, new sources of political tension. Sushun played his part. He performed the ceremonies, offered support for the new religion, and did his best to look like a sovereign ruler. But behind the screens of the imperial court, everyone knew who was really in charge, the Soga leader, Soga no Umako. Unfortunately for Sushun, kings and clans rarely share power gracefully. As the emperor grew more independent, possibly tired of being treated like a ceremonial ornament, relations with the Soga began to sour. According to the chronicles, Sushun was overheard expressing a desire to hunt a wild boar. The statement sounds innocent, almost pastoral, until one realizes that in the careful language of court politics, it was taken to mean something closer to, "I wish to hunt the head of Soga no Umako." And that was enough. In 592, after only 5 years on the throne, Sushun was assassinated, almost certainly at the Soga's command, the Krans. Eichels, always understated in tone, suggest he was stabbed to death by one of Umako's retainers. No dramatic rebellion, no climactic battle, just the quiet, final act of palace intrigue. With Sushun gone, the Soga clan placed Empress Suiko, a relative more agreeable to their influence, on the throne, and history moved on, as though the emperor had been little more than a passing note. Yet his story lingers, not because of grand accomplishments, but because it reflects the fragile nature of royal life. Even an emperor could be reduced to a footnote by those who controlled the palace corridors. Let's drift forward now, this time to a royal life that wasn't cut short by intrigue, but rather consumed by extravagance and eccentricity. Mad King Ludwig II of Bavaria. The Princes in the Tower. Tonight, we drift back to late 15th century England. The Wars of the Roses are winding down, at least on paper. But the Tudor dynasty has not yet taken root. The country is tired of civil war. The nobility is restless. And in the middle of it all, 2 boys vanish into history's mist, leaving behind one of England's most enduring royal mysteries. The year was 1483. King Edward IV had died suddenly, leaving the throne to his 12-year-old son, Edward V. Being 12, Edward was obviously not in a position to rule on his own, which meant a regency council would need to guide him until he came of age. This, in theory, should have been a straightforward process, but royal successions, particularly in medieval England, were rarely straightforward. The boy king's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, later known to history as Richard III, was named Lord Protector. It was a respectable position, one that placed him at the head of the regency while keeping him officially beneath the king he was meant to serve. But power has a way of tempting those who hold it, and Richard was no exception. Edward V, along with his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, was taken to the Tower of London. Now, this was not initially cause for alarm. In the 15th century, the Tower was more than a prison. It was a royal residence, an imposing fortress where monarchs often stayed before their coronations. The boys were lodged there comfortably, with attendants and tutors, while plans for Edward's coronation moved forward. But as weeks passed, plans began to shift. Rumors spread. Whispers that the late King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville might have been invalid, that their children, including Edward V, were technically illegitimate. Suddenly, the idea of Edward becoming king looked less certain. Richard, the uncle, began to gather support for his own claim to the throat. By the end of June 1483, he was crowned King Richard III, and the boys, they simply faded from view. No records state exactly what happened. No witness accounts survive of their final days. One moment, they were royal children awaiting a coronation. The next, they had vanished from the world stage entirely. Naturally, theories sprang up like weeds. The most enduring one blames Richard III himself. According to this version, the new king ordered their deaths to secure his throne, ensuring no loyalist faction could rise in the prince's name. But historians note a problem. Richard never publicly displayed proof of their deaths, nor did he produce their bodies, a strange choice if the goal was to remove doubt about succession. Another theory points to Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, who defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. If the princes were alive when Henry claimed the throne, their mere existence would have posed a threat to his legitimacy. Could he have had them quietly removed after the fact, rewriting history to place the blame on Richard? Possible, but again, evidence is scarce. A third theory, the softest of them all, suggests the princes may have died of illness or natural causes while in the tower. Medieval medicine was, at best, unpredictable, and even royal children were not immune to fever or infection. If this happened, Richard may have chosen silence, not to cover a crime, but to avoid the appearance of negligence. Centuries later, in 1674, workmen at the tower discovered a small wooden box buried beneath a staircase. Inside were the bones of two children. King Charles II ordered them interred at Westminster Abbey, believing they were the lost princes. Yet even this has never been conclusively proven. Modern testing has been proposed, but remains controversial, with the royal family showing little appetite for reopening the question. And so the story lingers, less a tale of murder than one of absence. Two young lives caught in the machinery of dynastic politics, reduced to speculation and whispers. No heroes, no villains fully proven, just a mystery that continues to drift through English history like fog over the Thames.